The first snowfall of the season glazed the cul-de-sac in a perfect white hush, each suburban home glowing with meticulous displays of twinkling lights and plastic reindeer. Sarah, staring out her frost-covered bedroom window, watched her son Daniel finish his snowman in the front yard. Daniel was 8, skinny, with a mop of auburn hair that refused to stay combed, and his laughter echoed faintly through the double panes. The snowman was oddly shaped, its torso slightly slumped and its head tilted, as though listening to a whispered secret. Daniel had given it coal eyes, a lopsided grin, and a carrot nose, like in the old songs. But there was something subtly off about its posture, something almost human. Sarah shivered, though the heater rattled warmly behind her, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she pulled the curtains closed before Daniel started waving at her. That night, after the candles in the windows dimmed and the neighborhood fell into its typical winter slumber, Sarah awoke to what sounded like footsteps crunching across snow. Her room was muzzled by thick curtains and walls, but the noise was distinct and deliberate, moving slowly past her house. She froze in bed, ears straining, but the sound ceased entirely, leaving her in a suffocating silence. She tried to convince herself it was just the wind scattering ice across the driveway or a stray animal, but her throat tightened when she remembered. It had snowed all day, tirelessly, covering the streets in fresh, untrodden powder. No one should be walking. Her thoughts flicked to Daniel, fast asleep down the hall, and the image of his crooked snowman resurfaced and lingered unwanted in her mind. The next morning, the snowman had moved. It was impossible, absurd, but as Sarah and Daniel stepped out of the house, she noticed it had shifted several feet closer to the porch. Its coal eyes seemed sharper somehow, less coal and more like something painted in their vacant blackness. Daniel giggled and said that maybe the snowman had wanted to be closer to them. Sarah didn't respond, her heart pattering uncomfortably in her chest. She studied it, keenly aware of a burst of vertigo as she stared into its uneven grin. By late afternoon, it had moved again, this time positioned unnervingly close to the base of the house steps. The footprints, which shouldn't exist, leading to and from the snowman, were bizarrely precise, almost measured, but melted as soon as Sarah tried to track them beyond the yard. Come evening, she found herself locking every door and window with trembling hands, her disbelief clashing with her undeniable fear. Yet when Daniel refused to stop talking about how much he liked the snowman, she didn't have the courage to throw it out. On Christmas Eve, Sarah's neighborhood was awash in muted cheer, distant laughter bubbling from each glowing house. She sat in the living room pretending to read, but her mind reeled around one singular fact. The snowman wasn't outside. She hadn't seen Daniel for an hour, though she'd called his name until her voice cracked. The TV blinked softly in the background, broadcasting a saccharine Christmas special, and the twinkling tree lights created long, uneven shadows across the room. They trembled suddenly as something outside darkened the window. It wasn't approaching snow or an errant cloud. Something much taller hovered just beyond the glass. She bolted for the door to call her son's name, but her voice faltered in her throat. There, leaning awkwardly at the threshold, was the snowman, or the haunting impression of where it had been. Its carrot nose dangled limply from its melted, pale frame, which now stretched impossibly tall. Daniel's ragged scarf was draped around what could only be described as shoulders. Coal mouth, still grinning, loomed wide as a shape shifted behind it, like a human figure with eyes no longer hollow, but hungry. The snow fell relentlessly outside the Stanton family home, casting the street in an eerie, muted white glow. Their neighborhood, lined with cheery holiday lights, felt unusually still under the weight of the storm. The houses were nearly identical, cookie-cutter perfection with wide lawns buried beneath heaps of snow, but tonight even the colorful lights seemed weaker, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Inside, the air was heavy with pine and cinnamon, as Elaine Stanton adjusted an ornament on their overly decorated tree for the third time that evening. She told herself she was simply nervous about the upcoming party, but her hands shook ever so slightly, betraying a deeper unease. Her husband, Mark, noticed but said nothing, choosing instead to tinker with the train set beneath the tree, his jaw tight with thought. Upstairs, their daughter Lily sat cross-legged by her frosted bedroom window, staring into the front yard where faint hoofprints had started to appear in the freshly fallen snow. A soft thud echoed far off in the night, sharp but deliberate, punctuating the silence. The sound came again, closer, and Elaine instinctively looked toward the front door as if expecting someone. Mark frowned, rising to peer through the peephole, his breath fogging the frosted glass. Nothing was there, but he lingered, his forehead pressed to the door as another heavy thud reverberated outside. Lily's voice drifted down the stairs, small and uncertain, asking if they could hear the sounds too. Mark told her to stay put, though his own conviction faltered. There was a growing tension, an electric vibrancy in the air, like a pressure building behind a storm. Elaine's heart began to race, filling her ears with the sound of her pulse as she whispered that maybe it was just a tree branch breaking under the weight of the snow. But where would the hoofprints have come from, she wondered silently, banishing the thought before it could take hold. Lily's voice appeared again, softer this time, saying she could see something now. Nothing more, just that. Mark finally opened the door, letting cold air rush violently into the house. The front steps and the yard beyond them were transformed. The spotless snow from the moments earlier was now torn apart, chaotically stamped with hoofprints deep enough to reveal the soil beneath. The prints formed no discernible path, almost as though whatever left them had spun wildly in place. Mark stared into the emptiness of the street, his body rigid, though he swore he detected faint shapes moving near the neighbors' hedges. Elaine pulled her robe tightly around herself, stepping out behind him, her slippers crunching in the snow. She clenched her jaw at the sight. A broken yard decoration lay in pieces by their mailbox, a doe figurine that had been part of their festive reindeer display. Only it wasn't just broken, it was shattered. Something red, too vivid to be paint, stained the white plastic as if intentionally smeared. Mark muttered to himself, a phrase about pranksters or wind, something to explain what they didn't understand. Elaine felt her skin crawl as she looked closer and realized chunks of earth were scattered through the snow, as though something had been digging. Hours later, the family locked the door and decided to turn in for the night, uneasy but resigned. Silence returned, punctuated only by the distant whispers of the storm outside. Elaine lay awake, tense under the duvet, her ears tuned to every sound. She couldn't help but feel there was something deeper than pranksters or wind at play. Lily's voice cut through the stillness again, soft and strangely unbothered this time. Something about how she was seeing reindeer now, running through the snow, graceful and endless. Elaine turned to wake Mark, but he was already sitting upright, staring blankly at the darkened hallway leading to Lily's room. The house felt freezing, colder than it should be, and yet a sweat broke out on Elaine's back as she heard the rhythmic sound of heavy hooves shuffling up the creaking staircase. It wasn't just a sound now. She could feel the vibration of it, in her chest, in her teeth. Before either parent moved, a new sound joined, the faintest whisper of a deep breath pluming in the cold just outside their door.
The McPhersons prided themselves on their immaculate suburban home, especially during the holidays. Each December, their lawn became a glowing spectacle of oversized reindeer, a jolly inflatable Santa, and twinkling string lights snaking up the trees. This year they added a newcomer, a life-sized Nutcracker soldier placed rigidly by the driveway, tall and finely detailed, with glassy eyes that seemed to follow passers-by. Sarah McPherson admired it from the bay window while sipping coffee. She loved these ornaments, loved the way they made the house hum with festivity. Yet, as she stared out that night, the lawn looked askew. She squinted and then laughed nervously. Surely the Nutcracker hadn't been posed an inch closer to the sidewalk since morning. It had to be a trick of the shadows, she thought. Could heavy winds have shifted it slightly? She shook it off, reminding herself that her husband, Greg, had secured it tightly with stakes before heading on a business trip to Chicago. By Friday, the unease had settled into her chest like a thick fog. Sarah stood barefoot by the front window, her breath misting the glass. The towering Nutcracker was definitely not where it had been. She couldn't pinpoint when she noticed, but it felt like every glance showed it closer to the house. She hadn't touched it. She was sure of that. Yet there it stood, now on the border of their flower beds, tilted ever so slightly forward, like it was mid-step. That evening she watched from under her duvet as the eerie glow of the lights illuminated its figure. How had she never noticed how sinister those painted eyes looked? Her mind toyed with explanations. A prank, maybe. Neighborhood kids must be sneaking into her yard. But as the hours passed and she drifted into an uneasy sleep, a distant scrape outside woke her. Her heart thundered as she listened, feet rooted to the floorboards. Not daring to look out, she clung to the thought that it was only the wind. By Saturday morning, a fresh layer of snow veiled the lawn, its surface pristine, except for something that made her stomach lurch. Deep impressions in the snow marred the perfect white sheet, beginning from the sidewalk and leading straight to her doorstep. Two distinct sets of prints. One belonged to a person, large and deliberate. The other, smaller, round outlines with a hint of a groove, matched the base of the Nutcracker. Sarah's throat tightened as she craned her neck to check the yard. Frozen at the base of the porch steps, the Nutcracker loomed taller than she remembered, almost brushing the bottom of her wreath-lined doors. She didn't call anyone. She didn't share the sight on social media. That would require admitting she might be losing her grip. Instead, she spent the day indoors, refusing to so much as glance outside. By nightfall, her nerves shattered at every creak the house made. Around midnight, in a fleeting moment of foolish courage, she grabbed her coat and jerked open the front door, ready to confront something. The driveway was empty. The Nutcracker was gone. She screamed, first in relief, then in rising terror as her eyes adjusted to the shadows just beyond the reach of the porch light. It hadn't been taken. It had moved again. It now stood near the fence, separating her yard from the neighbors. Its position had changed entirely. One arm half raised, the jaw slack, as though mid-command. She retreated inside, deadbolting the door, but its silhouette burned into her vision. Was it looking back? She told herself to go upstairs, to hide under the covers, but her legs seemed fused to the dusty welcome mat. When the first knock shook the door, soft, measured, she flinched so violently her teeth nearly bit her lip to the bone. Then came 3 more knocks, heavier this time. She stumbled back down the hallway and into the kitchen. A cold breeze snaked up her neck. She froze, suddenly realizing she'd left the side door unlocked earlier that day. Her breath hitched as her eyes snagged on the doorway leading to her basement. At the foot of the stairs, a shadow stood motionlessly, its glassy-eyed face reflecting the faint string lights from the outside lawn.